northwestern Puerto Rico. October 11th, 1918. 10:17 a.m. The sea suddenly pulls back nearly 200 meters in less than 3 minutes, exposing the rocky seabed, leaving fishing boats stranded on wet sand and fish flopping where water had been only moments before. Fishermen in Aguadilla stop repairing their nets. Children wander onto the exposed ocean floor, amazed by what they're seeing. Then comes the silence. The kind of silence that only exists before something unimaginable happens. Just 3 hours earlier, no one along Puerto Rico's western coast had any reason to believe they were living through the final hours of an ordinary morning. Mothers were preparing breakfast. Dock workers unloaded coffee shipments at the harbor. School children walked barefoot along sandy roads. Somewhere beneath the Mona Passage, however, an ancient fault line was reaching its breaking point. What happened between sunrise and the moment the ocean became a wall has never been fully reconstructed. Until now. Puerto Rico, October 1918. 20 years had passed since the island came under American administration following the Spanish-American War. Sugar fueled the economy, plantations stretched across much of the countryside, and the ports along the western coast operated almost without pause during harvest season. Mayagüez had become one of the island's busiest commercial centers, while nearby Aguadilla remained a quiet fishing town where life revolved around the sea. Wooden homes stood only a few steps from the shoreline. Boats lined the beaches before dawn, and each morning followed the same familiar rhythm that generations had known. There was no reason for anyone to expect that this Friday would be different. The Caribbean looked calm. The sky was clear. A gentle breeze carried the scent of salt, damp wood, and sugar mills operating farther inland. Families opened their windows to let in the morning air. Merchants prepared their stalls. Fishermen were already miles offshore, convinced it would be another ordinary day on the water. But beneath the Mona Passage, roughly 25 kilometers north of Puerto Rico's western coast, two immense tectonic plates had been locked together for decades. Invisible to everyone on the island, enormous pressure had been building deep beneath the seafloor. Modern seismology did not yet exist. There were no underwater sensors, no tsunami warning centers, no emergency sirens, and no evacuation plans. Earthquakes were understood only through memory, and memory can be dangerously short. The last destructive tsunami in the northeastern Caribbean had struck more than 50 years earlier, long enough for most people to believe such disasters belonged to another time or another place. That illusion of safety shaped every decision made on the morning of October 11th. No one noticed that the ocean floor was moments away from shifting with unimaginable force. No one recognized the invisible countdown already underway beneath the sea. And within just a few hours, an ordinary coastal morning would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in Puerto Rico's modern history. By 7 o'clock that Friday morning, life along Puerto Rico's western shoreline was unfolding exactly as it had countless times before. In Aguadilla, families opened their doors to the cool ocean breeze while charcoal stoves crackled to life for the first pot of coffee. Fishing boats that had left before dawn were already working the calm Caribbean waters. Their crews focused on the day's catch, rather than the quiet horizon surrounding them. Children still slept in small wooden homes roofed with corrugated metal, unaware that history was already moving beneath their feet. Along the waterfront, dock workers began unloading coffee and other cargo from small coastal vessels that had arrived during the night. The harbor echoed with familiar sounds, wooden crates sliding across weathered piers, ropes tightening against pilings, voices calling from one boat to another. Farther south in Mayagüez, merchants arranged fruit, vegetables, fresh fish, and fabrics beneath canvas awnings as customers slowly filled the marketplace. It was the rhythm of a prosperous Caribbean port, one built around commerce, agriculture, and the sea itself. The homes closest to the shoreline had not been placed there by accident. For centuries, Spanish colonial towns throughout the Caribbean had developed around their ports because every aspect of daily life depended on immediate access to the water. Ships carried food, sugar, coffee, tools, mail, and news from abroad. Living close to the harbor meant opportunity. The ocean was not viewed as a threat. It was the reason these communities existed in the first place. That confidence extended well beyond the towns themselves. In 1918, Puerto Rico had no earthquake monitoring network, no tsunami warning system, and no emergency plans for coastal evacuation. Scientists understood that earthquakes occurred, but the relationship between underwater earthquakes and destructive tsunamis remained poorly understood outside a handful of regions, particularly Japan. For most residents of Puerto Rico, the sea represented stability, livelihood, and routine. Very few people had ever witnessed the ocean behave differently. Beneath the surface, however, the island sat beside one of the most complex tectonic boundaries in the Atlantic. The Mona Passage, separating Puerto Rico from the Dominican Republic, marks the meeting point of the Caribbean Plate and the North American Plate. These enormous slabs of the Earth's crust move only a few centimeters each year, far too slowly for anyone to notice. But over decades, that movement stores extraordinary amounts of energy inside the surrounding rock. For more than half a century, stress had quietly accumulated beneath the seafloor north of Puerto Rico's western coast. No instruments existed to measure it. No satellites watched from above. No computers calculated probabilities. The science simply wasn't there yet. The people preparing breakfast, repairing fishing nets, opening shops, or walking toward the docks had absolutely no way of knowing that the ground beneath the Mona Passage had reached its limit. Around 8:30, women gathered beside the Culebrinas River to wash clothes, while children made their way toward small wooden schoolhouses near the coast. Teachers greeted students as they always had. Harbor officials checked shipping manifests and discussed arriving vessels. Fishermen farther offshore noticed nothing unusual. The sea remained almost perfectly calm, reflecting the bright October sky, as though it were polished glass. If someone had walked through Aguadilla or Mayagüez that morning carrying a camera, nothing would have seemed remarkable. Every image would have suggested an ordinary Friday in the Caribbean, a place defined by routine, hard work, and quiet confidence in the sea that sustained it. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape, hidden 25 kilometers offshore and 25 kilometers below the surface, immense geological forces were about to unleash one of the most devastating natural disasters in Puerto Rico's recorded history. The people living along the coast believed they understood the ocean because they had spent their entire lives beside it. Within the next few hours, they would discover that the greatest danger was not the sea they could see, but the one moving silently beneath them. At 9:12 that morning, the silence beneath the Mona Passage finally came to an end. Deep below the seafloor, a section of the fault that had remained locked for decades suddenly ruptured. In less than 20 seconds, millions of tons of rock shifted several meters, releasing an enormous amount of stored energy. Today, seismologists estimate the earthquake reached a magnitude of approximately 7.1. But in October of 1918, those numbers did not exist for the people living along Puerto Rico's coast. They experienced the event in the only way they could, through the violent shaking beneath their feet. Across Aguadilla, dishes crashed from shelves. Wooden homes creaked loudly as their frames twisted under the force of the tremor. Families rushed outside, instinctively seeking open ground while trying to understand what had just happened. In Mayagüez, the shaking was even stronger. Chunks of masonry broke loose from older buildings, Windows shattered, church bells rang unexpectedly, and harbor workers grabbed onto posts as the docks lurched beneath them. The earthquake lasted less than a minute. Then it stopped. For most people, that was the end of the emergency. Neighbors stepped into the streets to inspect cracked walls and damaged roofs. Shopkeepers checked their storefronts before reopening. Dock workers paused long enough to examine the wooden piers, then returned to unloading cargo. Teachers gathered frightened students into schoolyards until the ground became still again. Some schools dismissed classes out of caution. Others continued as though nothing more would happen. Looking back more than a century later, it's tempting to wonder why no one immediately fled inland. The answer is remarkably simple. There was no reason to. Earthquakes were not unknown in Puerto Rico. Older residents remembered previous tremors that had caused damage, but were followed by nothing more than cleanup and repairs. In living memory, an earthquake did not automatically mean a tsunami. The connection between the two simply wasn't part of public knowledge. Outside Japan and a few other regions with long histories of tsunamis, very few coastal communities understood that a powerful underwater earthquake could send enormous waves racing across the ocean. Even the word tsunami was virtually unknown throughout the Caribbean. Most people would have described unusual ocean behavior simply as a rough sea or a tidal disturbance, without recognizing it as a separate natural phenomenon. As life slowly resumed on shore, something invisible was already moving across the sea. The sudden movement of the ocean floor had displaced an immense column of water above it. In the deep waters of the Mona Passage, the wave barely changed the ocean's surface. A fisherman floating overhead would have noticed almost nothing. There was no towering wall of water, no white caps, and no dramatic swell rolling across the horizon. Instead, the tsunami traveled as energy hidden beneath the surface. Across the open ocean, it raced toward Puerto Rico's western coast at hundreds of kilometers per hour, carrying extraordinary force while remaining almost impossible to detect. Only when that energy reached the island's shallow coastal shelf would everything begin to change. During the 65 minutes that followed the earthquake, life continued almost normally. Children returned to their classrooms. Merchants reopened their stalls. Fishing crews prepared to head back toward shore with the morning's catch. Families swept broken dishes from kitchen floors and discussed the tremor with neighbors. No sirens sounded. No official warnings were issued. No government office sent evacuation orders. There were no radio broadcasts interrupting the morning. No emergency alerts. No helicopters circling overhead. In 1918, none of those systems existed. The only warning available was the one nature itself was preparing to give, and almost no one in Puerto Rico knew how to recognize it. While entire towns settled back into their routines, the tsunami continued its silent journey beneath the Caribbean Sea. Every passing minute brought it closer. Every conversation, every repaired fishing net, every reopened storefront unfolded during borrowed time. And when the ocean finally revealed what had been traveling toward the island all along, there would be only a few minutes left for anyone to understand what they were seeing. As the tsunami moved silently beneath the Caribbean, life along Puerto Rico's western coast slowly returned to normal. The earthquake had ended, and for most people, so had the danger. Families swept broken dishes from their floors, neighbors inspected cracked walls, and dock workers resumed unloading cargo as though the morning's disruption had already passed. Children returned to schoolyards, merchants reopened their stalls, and fishermen prepared to continue their routines. No one realized that the real disaster had not yet arrived. Far offshore, the tsunami remained almost impossible to detect. In deep water, it did not resemble the towering waves seen in movies. the ocean's surface looked calm, and boats floating above the wave noticed almost nothing unusual. The energy released by the earthquake was traveling beneath them, racing toward the coast at tremendous speed while remaining nearly invisible. Everything changed as that energy reached the shallower waters surrounding Puerto Rico. The wave began to slow, but it also began to rise. What had crossed the open sea unnoticed was now transforming into an unstoppable wall of water. Yet from the beaches, the horizon still appeared peaceful. There were no dark storm clouds, no strong winds, and no obvious signs that danger was approaching. Then, at approximately 10:17 that morning, the sea did something almost impossible to comprehend. The water began pulling away from the shore. At first, only a few people noticed the retreat. But within moments, the ocean continued moving farther back, exposing rocks, coral, and stretches of seabed that had never been visible before. Fishing boats settled onto wet sand, while fish flopped helplessly in shallow pools left behind by the disappearing water. Curiosity quickly spread through the community. Residents walked toward the shoreline to get a better look. Children eagerly explored the exposed seabed. They collected fish and shells from places that had been underwater only minutes earlier. Some believed the earthquake had somehow caused an unusually low tide. Others simply stood in amazement, unable to explain what they were seeing. Today, we recognize that retreating water as one of nature's clearest tsunami warnings. In 1918, almost no one in Puerto Rico knew that. To the people gathered along the beach, the disappearing ocean looked extraordinary, but not dangerous. They had no reason to believe that every meter the sea pulled away from the shore was preparing for an even more violent return. If stories like this fascinate you, consider subscribing, because there are many more forgotten moments in history waiting to be uncovered. And while you're here, I'd love to know where you're watching from, and which historical decade you'd like us to explore next. As the last fishing boats settled onto the exposed sand, a strange silence spread across the coastline. Then, far beyond the empty shoreline, the horizon began to rise. At first, it didn't look like a wave. People standing along the beaches of Aguadilla saw a dark line forming on the horizon, slowly growing taller as it moved toward the coast. It wasn't curling like ordinary surf, and there was no white foam breaking across the water. Instead, the entire horizon seemed to lift higher with every passing second. Then came the sound. Survivors would later describe it as a deep, continuous roar, unlike anything they had ever heard. Some compared it to distant thunder. Others said it sounded like an endless avalanche or a train racing across the landscape. The noise grew louder until it overwhelmed every other sound along the coast. Only then did people begin to understand that something was terribly wrong. At approximately 10:21 a.m., the first wave struck Aguadilla. Rising to nearly 6 meters in some areas, it slammed into the shoreline with devastating force. Wooden homes collapsed almost instantly. Fishing boats were lifted from the sand and hurled into nearby buildings. Docks splintered apart, and streets disappeared beneath a torrent of seawater carrying timber, debris, and pieces of entire houses. Those who had walked onto the exposed seabed had almost no chance of escape. Others ran through narrow streets searching for higher ground, but the water moved faster than anyone expected. Families were separated within seconds as the current swept through neighborhoods that had existed peacefully only moments before. In Mayagüez, the tsunami flooded sections of the harbor, damaging warehouses, businesses, and vessels tied to the docks. Cargo floated through the streets as survivors struggled to understand what had just happened. The earthquake they thought had been the disaster was only the beginning. When the first surge finally pulled back, many believed the danger had passed. People searched desperately for missing relatives, attempted rescues, and began pulling survivors from collapsed buildings. But the ocean returned. A second wave arrived minutes later, flooding areas that had just begun to emerge from the water and catching many rescuers completely off guard. Structures weakened by the first impact collapsed, while debris already scattered across the streets became even more destructive. By the time the sea finally retreated, entire sections of Puerto Rico's western coastline had been transformed. Homes had vanished. Boats that once provided a family's livelihood were destroyed or carried inland. Streets were buried beneath mud and wreckage, and communities that had awakened to an ordinary October morning were left trying to comprehend a tragedy unlike anything they had ever experienced. In just 65 minutes, the day had gone from a routine earthquake to one of the deadliest natural disasters in Puerto Rico's modern history. When the water finally settled, the full scale of the disaster began to emerge. Entire neighborhoods along Puerto Rico's northwestern coast had been transformed beyond recognition. Families searched through piles of broken timber where their homes had stood only hours earlier. Fishing boats that had supported generations of coastal communities were either destroyed or carried far inland. Roads disappeared beneath mud and debris, while churches, warehouses, and waterfront businesses faced damage that would take months, and in some cases years, to repair. Official records would later confirm at least 116 lives lost, although historians believe the true number may have been higher. Some victims were never identified. Others were simply never found, claimed forever by the sea that had sustained these communities for centuries. In the days that followed, investigators documented the earthquake, the unusual retreat of the ocean, and the devastating waves that followed. Piece by piece, they reconstructed what had happened beneath the Mona Passage that October morning. Their findings would eventually become one of the earliest detailed studies of a tsunami in the Caribbean. Yet for the survivors, scientific reports could never fully explain the shock of watching the familiar ocean transform into a force capable of erasing entire streets within minutes. The memory lived not in diagrams or measurements, but in stories passed from one generation to the next. More than a century has passed since that morning, but the geological forces responsible for the disaster have not disappeared. The tectonic boundary beneath the Mona Passage remains active today, continuing the slow movement that has shaped the Caribbean for millions of years. Modern technology has dramatically improved our ability to detect earthquakes and issue tsunami warnings. Scientists can now identify dangerous seismic activity within minutes. Emergency agencies have developed evacuation plans, and coastal communities have access to information that simply did not exist in 1918. Even so, one lesson remains unchanged. Technology can provide a warning. It cannot replace preparation. The people who survived that October morning did not fail because they ignored the signs. They failed because they had never been taught what those signs meant. They had no reason to associate a retreating ocean with an approaching wall of water. They reacted exactly as most people would have reacted with the knowledge available at the time. That may be the most haunting part of this story. Disasters are often remembered by the moment they strike, but they are shaped long before that, by what people know, what they believe, and what they have never been taught to expect. Looking back at October 11, 1918, it's easy to focus on the earthquake or the towering waves that followed. But perhaps the most unforgettable image is something much quieter. An empty stretch of ocean where the sea should have been, people standing in disbelief on the exposed seabed, unaware that they were witnessing nature's final warning. For 65 minutes, the people of Puerto Rico lived between two worlds. The familiar one they believed would continue forever, and another that was already racing toward them beneath the surface. They could not see it. They could not measure it. and they had no way of knowing that ordinary life was only minutes away from changing forever. Stories like this remind us that history is not just a record of what happened. It is also a record of what people understood at the time and how that understanding shaped every decision they made. The tragedy of 1918 was not simply the result of powerful geological forces. It was also the result of a world that lacked the knowledge and warning systems we often take for granted today. That is why remembering these events still matters, not only to honor those who lived through them, but to better understand the risks that continue to exist beneath seemingly calm waters. And if you enjoy these deeply researched historical reconstructions, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more forgotten moments like this waiting to be explored, each revealing how ordinary days became extraordinary chapters in history. And before you go, let me know in the comments, which forgotten event, place, or historical decade should we uncover next? Your suggestion might become our next documentary.